Welcome back to Pokemon Green. We are in Mount Otsukimi, or as it's called in the English version, Mount Moon, and we just found a potion or wound heal or whatever. And this is a rare candy. That's gonna come in handy later in the game. Definitely don't use these early in the game. That's way too much wasted experience. They're much more useful later. So now that we're in the first battle of this episode, now is as good a time as any to mention that the in-battle menu, particularly right here where you're selecting the move, has been changed around a little in the localization. This is because the attack names in English and in other Western languages are longer than in Japanese because we use single letters for our alphabet rather than syllables. So they take up more screen space, so they had to kind of move the menus around a little to make space for that. Something else that's lost in translation is that, you know the phrase whenever you use a technique? In English it's always the same. It's always Pokemon used move. And that never changes. In the Japanese version there are at least two different phrases that it can be, depending on the move. For example, for Nidorino's tackle, it's just Nidorino used tackle, but for Horn Thrust, it's Nidorino used its Horn Thrust attack. Which I guess is kind of a bad example because Horn Thrust's English name is literally Horn Attack, so it would be Nidorino used its Horn attack. Yeah, that doesn't sound very nice, does it? Anyway, I want to go back onto a topic that I've talked about before, and that is the localization of Pokemon names from Japanese to English and other languages. So, first of all, a refresher of my core argument. The idea of changing names in different languages, names that would already work in that language, not like something like Nazonokusa, for example, but names like, last time I used Transcell as an example, already in English, yet the English version changes it anyway to Metapod. Makes no sense, and the only thing that it does is make it more confusing for people speaking different languages to communicate about Pokemon. Now, I wasn't finished with my rant last time. I didn't have enough time. But one thing I wanted to mention was that when Pokemon X and Y came out, there was an Iwata Asks article where Junichi Masuda said, and I quote, "This time we wanted to make the names the same in every country around the world if possible. So those put to the task really struggled. However, the sense of accomplishment was incredible." What the hell are you talking about? Look at the names. Look at the names for X and Y and tell me with a straight face that they are any more the same in every country than in any of the previous generations. There is no noticeable improvement. I have no idea what Masuda is talking about here. But this goes to show that Masuda apparently recognizes the problem, or at least pretends to? But we're still not seeing any improvement over previous generations. I've also seen a video on Twitter, I think shortly after Sun and Moon were released. I've tried finding this again. I could not find it for the life of me. But basically what it was a Japanese TV segment showing a bunch of different localizers from all over the world discussing at a round table about what they're gonna call the Pokemon in their languages. So this isn't a bunch of individual localizers all over the world making their own decisions and not talking to each other. No, they are actually meeting somewhere and consciously deciding, okay, we're gonna keep this name in English and then change it back in German and then make it something completely different in French, even though the Japanese name is already named after a French word, so it would make sense anyway, and let's just call it something Spanish in Chinese. I don't fucking know. Are they purposely trying to confuse the shit out of everyone? Because that's the only way I can explain this shit still happening 8 generations into this franchise. But then they start talking about legendaries and they're specifically going like, well, for example, Lunala is called Lunala everywhere because we want everyone to know around the world that when someone says Lunala, they mean Lunala. Okay, so they're aware of the problem. But they only see it as a problem for legendaries because reasons. I don't know, why is it that legendaries are so special? I mean, yeah, sure, they're special, but why is it that only special Pokemon should have this treatment? If I say Korata, everyone should be able to know what I'm talking about rather than having to explain depending on who I'm talking to. Oh, it's Ratata in English or Radfratz in German or... I don't know, if I'm talking to a French guy, I had no idea what its name is. And the frustrating part is that whenever you state an opinion like this, that Pokemon's names shouldn't be localized like this, people always tell you that keeping the Japanese names would be a terrible idea because the Japanese names are all Japanese puns that we wouldn't understand. Except half the time that's not the case at all. And the localization is so random that they usually change the names that would already work in English anyway, but then sometimes they decide it's opposite day and keep a Japanese name, a decidedly Japanese sounding and Japanese meaning Japanese name like Dedenne, and just keep that in English. Oh yeah, but let's change fucking Koi King to Magikarp. Because reasons. Also, I love it if Gen 1ers make the argument that Pokemon names have gotten worse and therefore Generation 1 is better. Well, even if that was the case, unless you're referring to the Japanese names, which I wouldn't expect any Western Gen 1er to have any concept of the Japanese names at all, that would only be an argument for the localizations getting worse, not the games themselves. Not that that's the only reason that argument is stupid, because Generation 1 had some terrible names both in Japanese and in English. In fact, let's talk about some of them. I want to go over a few specific names that are worth mentioning, either because they're particularly good, particularly bad, or just interesting in some other way. I've already had some on-screen text notes about the starters' Japanese names in the first episode, but let's get into a bit more detail here. The Fushigidane family is one of my favorite Japanese names, actually, because, well, Fushigidane itself is, it literally means mysterious seed, but it can also be read as something like, isn't it mysterious, or it's strange, isn't it? This theme continues in its evolution Fushigiso, which literally means mysterious grass, but can also mean something like, it seems mysterious. And would you look at that, a Moonstone! Our Nidoran only evolved into Nidorino in the last episode, now we already get to evolve it into Nidoking. This is one of the reasons why the Nidoran family is such a good in-game Pokemon. It evolves into its final stage this early in the game, and it's not a bad Pokemon like, you know, the level 10 bugs. This one is actually useful throughout the entire game. But I think I'm gonna go and switch Fushigiso back into the lead because it is now undeniably weaker than Nidoking after evolving, so it needs the experience a little bit more. The same thing applies to the female Nidoran family, I just have a slight preference for the males. Cue the Kotaku article. Alt-right misogynist Let's Player prefers Nidoking over Nidoqueen! No, thankfully I'm not popular enough for that to happen. Now this Rocket Gangster is noteworthy because he has a level 16 Rattata with Hyper Fang. He can be kinda tough if you're under-leveled. He's definitely harder than most NPCs in this area, or at this early stage in the game. And that's why in Yellow, as well as Fire Red and Leaf Green, they nerfed him into having, instead of this level 16 Raticate as his only Pokemon, he instead has a level 13 Korata and a level 13 Zubat. Because God forbid these games are ever challenging. Anyway, back to Pokemon names. The third line of the Fushigi family, Fushigibana, is the least creative out of the three. This one is literally just means mysterious flower. There's no clever double meaning for this one. So this whole thing about Pokemon's names having double meanings that can be interpreted as sort of expressions is kind of a running theme in the anime. This is a detail that is lost in translation with the anime, where sometimes they will have Pokemon say their names, but they will actually mean it as in an expression. Obviously, the most notable example is Sonansu, which is Wobbuffet in English, and that's a running joke that is completely lost in the translation, where it will randomly pop out and say Sonansu, which essentially means that's right. But they've done it with other Pokemon as well, and I know they've done it at least once with Shigidane just going like Dane, like, I know, right? So that's an example of a Gen 1 family that has really good names in Japanese. Let's talk about some bad ones. There are a lot of Pokemon, especially in Generation 1, whose Japanese names are literally just the English names of what they're based on. Like, Haunter is Ghost, and Krabby is just Crab, Drowsy is Sleep, Charmeleon is Lizard. So English-speaking fans who like the Japanese names typically use romanizations that have a bit of a funky spelling to make them sound a little more creative, or just romanizing it differently, like Lizardo instead of Lizard, or Sleep with an E at the end, and stuff like that. Oh, and another one, Pidgeotto in Japanese is just pigeon, which is a nice segue to the localization of the Pidgey family, because this is a mess. Their Japanese names are Popo, Pigeon, and Pidgeot. So the English names, let's start with Pidgey. There's nothing really to say about this one, except that it's just a terribly uncreative name. Next, Pidgeotto and Pidgeot. This is where things just get stupid. Because both of these names are just different romanizations of Pidgeot's Japanese name. Or in other words, if you were to transcribe Pidgeotto and Pidgeot back into Japanese, they would be exactly the same. I mean, I know tons of people have pointed out that these two look a bit too similar, but this is just ridiculous. Hell, maybe this is actually the reason why 4Kids messed up in the first movie and called a Pidgeot a Pidgeotto. I don't know. There's also the infamous Mr. Mime, which would create huge problems later down the line, and there are still people to this day who think there are no female Mr. Mimes just because of its English name. Speaking of which, there's this meme-type image that I've seen floating around the internet of someone going like, "Today I realized that Squirtle is based on both a squirrel and a turtle." And you know they come to that conclusion because of its English name, when there's nothing in the Japanese version that indicates this. And you know what? Ready for me to blow your mind? Squirtle is called Squirtle because it's a turtle that squirts water. Wow! Who would have thought? Am I a genius or what? I swear this fandom is full of fucking idiots. And if you look in this corner, there is yet another Moonstone. So if you had both a Nidorino and a Nidorina, you can evolve them both into their final stage before the second gym. I can't stress this enough. This is so good. Not that having two Pokemon that similar in your team is ever a good idea, but, you know, just the idea that you can have a final form before the second gym in itself is just fucking awesome. A good final form, I mean, not like Butterfree or some shit, but hey, I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, so how about we go back to Pokemon names? Another one of those theories, kind of like the Squirtle thing that I keep hearing, is that Psyduck and Golduck have been supposedly switched around. Like, Psyduck was supposed to be called Golduck, and Golduck was supposed to be called Psyduck, because Psyduck has kind of a golden color, and Golduck has stronger psychic powers. So let's do some fact-checking here. Let's look at the Japanese names. Golduck is called Golduck in Japanese as well, so that rules out the possibility of the localizer switching the two around. But maybe it was the Japanese who made this mistake. So let's look at Psyduck's Japanese name. It's Koduck, which literally translates to child duck. So even if you swap the two Japanese names around, it still wouldn't make sense, because then the adult one would be called Child Duck. So yeah, the whole theory about Psyduck and Golduck having their names switched around, complete bullshit. I think a far more likely explanation for why the blue one is called Golduck is because, well, in Generation 1, the sprites came first and the artwork second. And the sprites were in black and white. So someone probably looked at the sprite and called it Golduck, and then the person who drew the artwork, Ken Sugimori, just drew it in blue and, didn't really talk to the person who came up with the name Golduck. So if you ever see a theory like that, just look at the Japanese names. A lot of those are really easily debunked by just looking at the Japanese names. So a very little known oddity is that for some reason this 4x4 area around the fossils is programmed to never have any wild encounters on it. I have no idea why this is the case, but it's the case even once you have already picked the fossils. So I picked the Helix fossil. It really doesn't matter which fossil you picked. Both of these Pokemon are pretty bad in Generation 1, and I don't recommend using either of them, but I guess I'm picking Helix just for the memes.